Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, obviously this is not church. Everybody didn't say good afternoon. Delighted to be here for International Women's Day and with this illustrious panel of colleagues from very different parts of my life. We have Jen Gavito, who is a non-resident senior fellow, Scowcroft's Middle East Security Initiative, Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East with the Atlantic Council, and former acting principal, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Jen?
Hi, Gina.
Hi. We have Tressa Gunov, Director of Programs and Operations and Senior Fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. Welcome.
Good to see you.
Thank you. And Victoria Taylor, Director of the Iraq Initiative at the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East here at the Atlantic Council. Welcome. Okay, so I'm supposed to take a few minutes to set the stage for the discussion, but of course, we're all watching the news, so I don't really have to say very much, except that we are at war. Congress voted not to do a War Powers Act effort. There are over 20 countries involved, and we have seen that the reasons, the goals for this war have changed over the last 6 days. And that's where we are, among other things. So I'm going to start with Tressa. The theme of this year's International Women's Day Forum is shaping a broader international order. So we'd be remiss not to discuss the global impact of this war. As I said, lots of countries involved and more joining that have happened beyond the region, especially as Iran is viewed as part of a growing axis of adversaries for the United States, especially in terms of its relationship with Russia. We had a little bit of discussion about drones and their impact in the fireside chat and drone manufacturing in Moscow's war against Ukraine. Now there's even a Ukrainian connection here. So could you talk a bit about how Iran's position within this axis of adversaries is shifting in this war, and what might the implications of this shift mean? Thank you.
Certainly, thank you. Well, no matter how this ends, Iran is going to be weakened, and its role in that axis is going to be weakened. I think when it comes to Russia, there's always been a transactional relationship between Russia and Iran. And certainly Iranian technology contributed to battlefield edge for Russia when it comes to the Shahed drones and other technological exchanges that they probably have had, or at least is speculated to have had. But my guess is Russia has planned, they've seen the writing on the wall for quite some time with the multiple exchanges with the 12-day war and other U.S. interactions with Iran from a military perspective. And so, they have probably planned for this day for quite some time and have the ability to produce, or at least are aiming to have the ability to produce their own drones and keep that piece going on their own. When it comes to China, I think Iran definitely needs China far more than China needs Iran, and that's always been the case. I think that North Korea, which comes up a lot as part of that axis, is probably, as my colleagues had sort of joked yesterday, quite pleased with itself that it had already gotten its nuclear program. But I think that the dynamic there, probably from the North Korean perspective, is something that would not be a major loss, but I welcome others to comment on that. So I think it will change the dynamic, and of course the dynamic in the Middle East with Iran's proxies being weakened, Hezbollah, Hamas, the militias in Iraq, the Houthis to some degree, although not much. That constellation is going to be is still weakened, and it was something that held together a lot of assumptions, I think, for certain type of deterrence that the axis of of aggressors, so to speak, has relied on for a long time. So those challenges have been fundamentally, those assumptions have been fundamentally challenged by this, and will continue to have pressure on that interaction and that relationship.
Great, thank you. Jen, you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iran and Iraq during the Women, Life, Freedom movement. Can you provide some insight into how the U.S. government saw that movement as a political liability for the regime, and how you approach supporting the protesters? How does this differ from our approach to January 2026 massacre protesters?
Sure, that's a great question. So the Women, Life, Freedom movement, I think, was one of those moments. There have been a few over the last 40 years that really capture the imagination of the international community, but certainly within Iran as well. And it was, I think it's important to note, it was organic. It was, after the brutal beating of a young woman, and it really sparked some of the most sustained protests that we've seen in Iran in a decade or more. The narrative around that was very important, but I caution that I don't think that at any point was the regime under pressure. We were quite careful from within government to shape how we talked about it. And I say this deliberately, juxtaposed against what's happening right now. Because the regime stayed firmly in charge throughout that period, we were very aware of the danger of encouraging people to go out. And so we were actually making pretty forward-leaning statements saying that we are not going to come help you. We helped provide internet services to maintain connectivity so that protesters could coordinate amongst themselves, for example, but we were very careful never to assert that help was coming. And so, of course, that's a little bit different than what we heard last month when, again, people took to the streets, and this administration went out with a statement that help is on the way. And what that does is encourages people to go out thinking that there's a degree of protection that there isn't. And I, cringed because I was skeptical that help was on the way of the variety that they would need in order to be protected if they choose to go out at great personal risk themselves and protest. And I think that's played out. Obviously, the numbers vary widely from several thousand to tens of thousands that were killed in those protests. But the reality, I think, when you talk about regime change and the types of organic movements that need to happen in order for that to be successful, those elements aren't there right now. And that is, I know a pessimistic view, but I think it's an important one to be realistic about. There is no unifying figure. The opposition is not well armed. And so when we tell people help is on the way, that implies a control over a regime change that I frankly don't think that the United States currently has. And so Women, Life, Freedom, I think, was important. It shone a light on the difficulties that women face in Iran. And I think international community, really kind of coalesced around that. But that is a very different thing than actually a change in regime, unfortunately.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we've talked a little bit about the cost to the Iranians right now. Victoria, I'd like to move on and broaden this out a bit, because shortly after the U.S.-Israeli strikes, Iran responded with a breadth of attacks against its neighbors. Can you give us some insight into how Gulf countries are responding? And how do you see the conflict unfolding for states with a heavy Iranian presence, such as Lebanon and Iraq?
Right. So I think what we saw, following the initial attacks by the United States and Israel was fairly predictable. And even the supreme leader ahead of the strikes, as we saw U.S. forces really amassing in the region, the supreme leader said explicitly, I'm going to make this a regional conflict, and the United States is going to pay for this action. So, what we're seeing is not a surprise, and it's part of an Iranian effort to really inflict great pain throughout the region action in hopes that it can both protect the survival of the regime, really raise the cost to the United States and Israel, and hopefully encourage some of the other Gulf countries to also put pressure on the U.S. and Israel to stop striking it. I think what we're seeing is, while there may have been, some frustration with the United States and Israel for launching these strikes, and indeed, several, a month ago or so, when we were initially contemplating strikes, many of those countries encouraged President Trump not to launch them. Most of them right now are ultimately very frustrated with the Iranians. And while, it's not clear to me that that will result in any of those countries taking direct military action, I don't think we can completely rule that out if they feel that that is what is needed in order to protect their own security interests. And so I think that while, Iran's effort to really expand the conflict is expected, the reaction from the Gulf countries has perhaps been a little bit different than I might have anticipated.
Yeah. Moving back to Teresa. Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism and utilizes a network of proxies in the Middle East to threaten regional stability. We've seen Iran attempt to exercise its influence in Africa, including involving interventions in Ethiopia and Sudan. What impact would this war have on Iran's proxies and their capabilities in the near and long term, as well as on its interventions in Africa? How could it shape its ability to project power beyond its borders?
That's a great question. Well, as I mentioned earlier, of course, Iran's proxy networks are definitely degraded. There's no question that, after October 7th and through multiple sort of subsequent actions, either by the Israelis or the United States, there's been a degradation that has reduced its deterrent effect, so to speak, that part of the reason it had those networks, but also its general credibility and its ability to control those networks. It definitely puts, groups like Hezbollah into really tough position, right? They, in some ways, have an obligation to become involved in this conflict in some way, shape, or form, but certainly domestically within Lebanon, that puts it in an extremely difficult position because that's not welcome at all. Not that it was, and so there's a increasing cost to be paid for having been supported, trained, and equipped by Iran for many decades, and so that. The dynamic about how that plays out is going to be important. Iraq with the Houthis in Yemen, who have been struck by the United States, but certainly, at least in my estimation, are not diminished in a significant way. It will be interesting to see just what control, as the Iranian leadership continues to be targeted, how that control is exercised, if at all, and what it will mean to the broader conflict. Iran has certainly been present in Africa in a lot of different places, as you note, and some of that is just sheer desire to make money. Of course, they have peddled arms, drones, and other things, and I think it's certainly not probably going to be top of their list as if the regime is going to recover at all. If there's a scenario in which that happens, I don't think Africa will be top of the list because of the other damage that it's probably going to have to recover from, and just the financial damage, let alone military production and other things that Iran was able to do, and much more easily before this, or at least we'll see. We'll see what the battle damage looks like. So I think that will be diminished and potentially less welcome, although it's very complicated when it comes to situations like Sudan. So overall, it's in a weakened state. I'm sure they're very aware of that and have prepared for contingencies in all likelihood of a degradation of of its abilities to control its networks. But I turn to my fellow panelists to see if they have additional thoughts on how that might be affected over the long term. Yeah.
Fair enough. Do either of you want to weigh in now?
Well, maybe I'll come in a little bit on the proxies. Obviously, I'm covering Iraq right now, and I was covering Iraq and Iran at the State Department. And I think, it is interesting right now to see, while we've had Hezbollah come into the fight, and while we've had the Iraqi militias start to launch attacks, we've not had the Houthis come in. And so I think, there's some major questions about why that's the case. I don't have a great answer for that yet. And I think we have to see how this is going to play out with some of the proxies, in a situation where Iran becomes more weakened and forced to really focus more internally. How will that impact both Iran's control over the proxies and its abilities to really support them?
Yeah, I would just add that I think the Lebanon piece, too, is interesting. I mean, they've come in, but it's been largely not under the command and control of either Iran or the organization itself. And so while there's been a bit of freelancing that I think Israel is responding to, it is a fundamentally changed landscape than it was 2 years ago.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, well, Jen, I'll stick with you for the moment. President Trump recently commented that many of the possible successors to Khamenei have been killed in strikes, while the late Supreme Leader's son, Mujtaba Khamenei, has emerged as the front runner to be his successor. And I believe the president said today that was unacceptable, and he needed to have a role in selecting the next leader of Iran. So what do you think's in the president's head? What do you perceive?
Thank you so much for that question, Gina.
Couldn't let it
That's
pass,
great.
darling. What do you perceive as the ideal line of succession for the United States from this administration's perspective? And what would be the implications if Khamenei's son assumes leadership?
Well, let me start with the back end of that first, and what the implications are. Every exercise that's been done over the last decade or so by the U.S. and its allies have suggested that if you try to impose regime change from outside, that the IRGC is the likely successor. And indeed, his older son does seem to be the chosen one from the IRGC itself. When you get into operations like this, I think it's very important that you think through those contingencies in advance and have a vision for what success looks like. And I am concerned that maybe that didn't happen to the extent that it should have, in that the way that this is unfolding seems to lead to a likely conclusion of the IRGC consolidating power rather than giving it up. And while I know that there was a lot of discussion about regime change, particularly during the protests in January, again, if you had looked at the conditions that are required for it, I think that it would have been clear that a sustained effort that the U.S. was unlikely to commit to would be the outcome there. And so you have set up a situation where you're likely to usher in a harder line regime than you had. While I understand the president's interest in ensuring that that doesn't happen, I'm not sure how much control we frankly have over that. I think that somebody asked the other day, what would be the president's ideal scenario? And I really do think going into this that the ideal scenario that he had in mind was something akin to Venezuela, where you kill, as you did the first day of this conflict, the top level leadership, and then you're able to shape what comes after that. But Iran is a different place. 90 million people, bureaucratic structures, regional governments. It is not a Syria and it's not a Libya. And so there is succession planning, there is a constitution, and all of those things come into play. And so simply by getting rid of the top leadership, you don't have a Delcy Rodriguez that you can, put into place and mold. And so I will refrain from trying to project what the president might want and just question how likely it is that the U.S. is going to have a role in this, absent the types of sustained operations necessary to really undertake regime change, and then that opens up a whole new line of questioning.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges for the administration is that difference between Venezuela, which is Iran is not a one-man show. unlike Venezuela. I have another question, but I want to open it up to the audience. I want to give you all a chance as well to ask questions of these amazingly knowledgeable panelists. So I'm going to ask my question, but I understand there are mics somewhere in the room. So if you would raise your hand if you are interested in asking a question. We have two here.
Thank you
Great.
so much. My question is, in the best case scenario, if you can imagine, do you see anything happening according to what is right now, planned by the current administration? And what is your vision on the best case scenario of the situation that is happening right now?
I think you probably get 4 different answers, but let's start with Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that Jen just said, and I think one of the challenges that we're facing right now is that we're having, the administration's talking points really give you the sense that we're not clear about what our objective is. There's both statements suggesting that we're pursuing regime change and then other statements suggesting that we would like a Venezuela model. Those are very different objectives that could produce wildly different results and should have wildly different operations. And so, I'm not sure now, which I still have not figured out which one it is that we're actually focused on right now. And some of the things that we're doing, might suggest more of an effort towards regime change. But as Jen said, I don't think that we're able to completely control this scenario. And as we've seen, throughout U.S. history and our efforts to really engineer regimes that are, advancing U.S. interests, very low success rate around the world. And so I would say, a best case scenario, very difficult to predict what will happen, even if we topple the regime, who would be able to take charge of the country. I'm a little bit skeptical that we're able to fully topple a regime which has been built with multiple layers and succession plans in order to actually ensure its survival.
While we're waiting for the microphone to get to another, I'd like you all to address the possible divergent aims between the United States and Israel.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So regime change in Iran has been an objective of Prime Minister Netanyahu for the better part of 20 years at least. He has, over the course of those 20 years, worked closely with the United States, with administrations across parties, to constrain Iran's behavior, but ultimately that's been the goal. And I think in the Trump administration, he finally found a U.S. administration that was friendly to that effort and willing to go along with that. I think for all the reasons that we just talked about, it is not necessarily in the U.S. interest. And you talk about what best case scenario could be. I think at this point, it would probably be, we can all coalesce around the idea that Iran should not have nuclear weapons, that its missile program is deeply damaging to the region. And so degrade those, call it a success, and walk away. That is not what Prime Minister Netanyahu's goal is here. And so I think the end state and some of maybe the challenge over articulating, like Victoria said, what the goal is actually based on this question itself. But there is a significant divergence in how I think we would like to see that end. The other thing I would say is I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is less concerned, perhaps than we are, about the destabilizing effects in places like Iraq, for example. That should be a core national security interest for the United States.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I have a question because we are celebrating Women's Day. I have not really heard much about the women. I know we all know the way that the world is, but we also have learned that if we as women do not become or remain active, things also are not as positive as we can imagine. So my question is, what can we do as women to support the women in Iran, whether it is through private, public NGOs, different groups because I feel like their voices are a little bit less heard. And we are such a powerful group, even of women in the United States and in the world. Maybe it's time for us to start shaping and thinking a little bit differently. Thank you.
Yeah, Tressa, you want to start with that one?
Well, others can comment on sort of the indigenous movements within Iran that women have been leading so bravely. I think that there are a number of ways. We just recently had a Reporters at Risk event here at the council through our Adrian Arsh National Security Resilience Initiative that focused on trying to help that community get information out of Iran. That's one piece where we can continue to try to make connections that help elevate women's voices in that process. I think regionally it's also important to think about the implications for women about this conflict, right? Women and children are certainly disproportionately affected as refugees, and their safety is always most jeopardized. And you look at Iraq, Syria, Jordan, places in Jordan, Lebanon and elsewhere. And so getting those stories out and finding support for women and children to be protected from radicalization and also predatory behavior, human trafficking and other things, I think is really important. But I'll turn it to my colleagues.
I don't have a lot to add to that. I mean, I think one of the challenges of the posture that we've had towards Iran, and there's good reasons for it as discussed, but over recent years, again, across administrations, there's been very little people-to-people contact. And one of the best ways that we have to support women is through the soft power that we project and modeling support for women's rights, et cetera. But when we don't have those opportunities to engage directly with the Iranian people, we take ourselves largely out of that conversation.
Maybe I just add, actually the Iranian women are really at the forefront of all of the political and social movements of Iran. We have, unfortunately, many of those women who are in jail for their activism. So I think the more that we can do to really highlight their stories, to support organizations, that are based overseas that are also trying to highlight the stories and voices of women to provide them with the tools for their own activism. I think those are things that are very valuable.
All very useful and also showing what the limitations are. We are wrapping up, so if you can give me 15 seconds each on how you anticipate the U.S.'s role in this conflict evolving in the near term and the outcome. You can even give me how long is this going to last?
That is unclear. I think Secretary Hegseth mentioned 8 weeks recently in a press conference, but I don't know if that's something that he can count on, and so I won't guess exactly how long it will last. But I think from a U.S. perspective and Israeli perspective, there are limitations from munitions and readiness perspectives that will always constrain what you can do in a highly complex military environment like this. So that's going to be a foundational question. And it goes from everything from launchers to interceptors to being able to rotate out personnel. So that's going to be foundational.
Well, with that, we are going to wrap this up and say thank you very much to this amazing panel. Catch them in the hallway if you can. And I believe Ambassador Ramayad is coming up next. Thank you.